The end of the dollar didn't begin with a stock market crash or a declaration of war. It began on a Tuesday morning in a quiet suburb of Ohio, when a gallon of milk cost $40, and the cashier simply shook his head, asking for something real instead. The collapse was not the loud, fiery spectacle Hollywood had promised. There were no riots in the first week, nor were there burning banks or televised screams. The death of the global reserve currency was, terrifyingly, a silent affair. It started with the servers. Deep in a subterranean data center in Northern Virginia, buried under layers of reinforced concrete and temperature-controlled argon gas, the algorithm tasked with stabilizing the Treasury bond market, a piece of code designed to simulate confidence where none existed, finally overheated under the weight of unpayable sovereign debt. It did not sound an alarm. It simply ceased to bid. For 70 years, the global economy had rested on the assumption that if no one else wanted American debt, the machine would buy it. But the machine had reached its hard logic limit. The yield curve didn't just invert, it shattered. It was a mathematical suicide pact. By the time the notifications hit the phones of commuters on the A train and farmers in Nebraska, the purchasing power of the United States dollar had evaporated by 60% in pre-market trading. The numbers on the screens blinked red, then gray, then static. The panic that followed wasn't about selling. It was about the realization that there was nothing left to buy. The question wasn't whether the system had failed. It was why we ever trusted it to begin with. To understand the magnitude of this silence, one must understand the psychology of the modern investor. For decades, they believed that value was something stored in binary code, protected by firewalls and Federal Reserve assurances. They believed wealth was a concept detached from the physical world, a score kept by central bankers. But when the algorithm died, it revealed the terrifying fragility of abstraction. A wealth manager named Marcus, sitting in a glass office in Greenwich, Connecticut, stared at his terminal as 3 decades of accumulated wealth, numbers representing leverage on leverage, vanished. It didn't fly away. It just mathematically ceased to be relevant. He tried to transfer funds to a Swiss account, but the transfer bar just spun, a digital purgatory. Across town, a plumber named Stan was tightening a flange on a leaking boiler. Stan didn't know the bond market had imploded. He didn't know that the pension funds were dissolving or that the derivative market, a quadrillion-dollar house of cards, had just caught fire. He only knew that the water was stopping and the pressure gauge was reading true. In that split second of realization, the axis of the world tilted. The man with the spreadsheet was suddenly a pauper. The man with the wrench was a king. It was the first tremor of a massive value reversal. A correction not of prices, but of reality itself. Marcus looked at his hands, soft and uncalloused, and realized for the first time that they were useless. Stan wiped grease on his overalls, unaware that he was now the asset class. The chaos that ensued in the following hours was specific and bizarre. It wasn't looting. It was a paralysis of exchange. At a coffee shop in Midtown Manhattan, a line of customers stood frozen. The card readers were declining everything. Amex, Visa, Apple Pay. The barista, a 20-year-old student, looked at the manager. The manager looked at the news on the television, where a breathless anchor was explaining that the dollar was effectively trading at zero against gold, oil, and grain. A man in a tailored suit offered a $100 bill for a latte. The manager laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Sir," he said, pointing to the milk carton, "the plastic this milk comes in is worth more than that paper." Inside the West Wing, the atmosphere was less panic and more cold. Calculated fury. The year was 2026, 2 years into the term of Donald Trump, the 47th president. Outside the gates, the DC traffic was gridlocked, not by protesters, but by confused drivers whose toll passes no longer worked. Inside, the president sat behind the resolute desk, staring at a report from the Federal Reserve chairman, a man whose resignation letter was already drafted on the table, signed in an ink that felt more permanent than the currency he had managed. The room was crowded, yet stiflingly quiet. The traditional levers of power were gone. Interest rates were meaningless when money printed faster than ink could dry. To raise rates now would be to banish oxygen from a dying fire. To lower them would be to pour gasoline on the ashes. The advisors in the room, a volatile mix of old-school protectionists in ill-fitting suits and Silicon Valley futurists in designer hoodies, pitched the standard solutions. One suggested a new digital currency, a Fed coin that could be tracked and expired to force spending. Another suggested a peg to Bitcoin, essentially handing American sovereignty to a decentralized ledger. A general in the corner, his face grim, suggested a desperate war to seize oil reserves, hoping that blood could back the dollar when gold could not. The debate raged. A tech billionaire, serving as an external consultant, leaned over the desk. "Mr. President," he urged, "we have to digitize the debt. We make the dollar virtual, float it on the blockchain, and reset the ledger. It's a soft default." The president rejected them all. He waved a hand, dismissing the digital charts projected on the wall. He understood something the economists missed, something visceral that resonated with his own erratic but undeniable intuition. The American people didn't want a new currency. They didn't want a new lie to replace the old one. They wanted value. He looked at the tech consultant with disdain. "You want to give them more code?" he asked. "They can't eat code. They can't eat Bitcoin," the president reportedly muttered, looking out the window at the rose garden. "And they can't live in a stock option." The administration called it the Strategic Asset Preservation Order. History would later call it the Great Reversion. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, based on the theory that if the financial system was a parasite killing the host, the only way to save the host was to stop feeding the parasite. President Trump's decision was blunt and unprecedented. Executive Order 114099 effectively froze the exchange of the dollar for international debts, declaring that the United States would strictly trade in tangible commodities for the foreseeable future. It was a default in all but name, but the most radical clause was domestic: the suspension of capital gains tax on the direct trade of goods and services. In one stroke, the president delegitimized the dollar as the middleman of American life. He didn't just break the banking system, he told the American people to ignore it. The intent was to empower the working class, the builders, the farmers, the mechanics, whose skills were tangible assets. But as the ink dried, the unintended consequences began to ripple outward. The order was meant to save the economy. Was it actually the funeral rite for capitalism? The side question that no one dared ask in that Oval Office meeting was this: if you strip away the abstraction of money, do you liberate the poor, or do you merely unshackle the strong? Civilization is, in many ways, a pact to protect the weak from the strong by using money as a buffer. Without that buffer, the world becomes very small and very sharp. The frail grandmother with a pension is protected by the concept of the dollar. In a world of wheat and steel, who protects her? Because once you tell a population that money is fake, you cannot untell them. The reaction from the global stage was instantaneous and violent. The European Union, already fracturing under its own debt and energy crises, froze all American assets. The Eurozone bureaucrats stared in horror as the American pivot to commodities rendered their own fiat currencies instantly suspect. In Beijing, the CCP announced the immediate dumping of all U.S. treasuries, flooding a market that no longer existed. They attempted to weaponize the debt, but you cannot bankrupt a debtor who has already decided that the debt is imaginary. The global financial system, a delicate web of trust woven since Bretton Woods, dissolved overnight. But the real shift was happening in the aisles of Home Depot and the chat rooms of Discord. Without a reliable medium of exchange, the American consumer stopped consuming and started negotiating. It was chaos, but it was a chaos of high utility. A mechanic in Detroit didn't want dollars for a brake job. He wanted 6 months of internet access or a side of beef. A graphic designer found herself destitute, her skills suddenly untradeable in a market desperate for calories and shelter, until she learned to trade her ability to organize information for a share of a neighborhood garden's harvest. The corporate lattice cracked. The giants of industry, bloated on cheap credit and global supply chains, were paralyzed. Amazon, the cathedral of convenience, faced an existential crisis. Their algorithms could predict what you wanted to buy, but they couldn't figure out how to accept 3 chickens and a generator repair as payment for a flat-screen TV. The logistics network froze. Drivers refused to drive for numbers on a screen. Warehouse robots sat idle because the electricity providers demanded payments in coal or natural gas, not wire transfers. Walmart couldn't process plumbing services. The giants of industry were paralyzed, while the local bazaar roared back to life, fueled by desperation and digital connectivity. Consider the collapse of just-in-time delivery. For 40 years, efficiency was the god of supply chains. Warehouses were kept empty, relying on the constant flow of trucks. When the drivers stopped driving, the shelves went bare in 48 hours. The panic buying wasn't for toilet paper this time. It was for seeds, nails, and ammunition. The suburbs, once the bastions of quiet consumption, turned into localized fiefdoms. Homeowner associations, previously concerned with the height of lawn grass, transformed into security councils and food co-ops. The neighbor who knew how to can vegetables was suddenly elected president of the cul-de-sac. The escalation came not from foreign armies, but from the supply chain's inability to understand barter. The logistical algorithms that ran the world were designed for currency, not capability. Shipping containers piled up in Long Beach, creating a rust-colored mountain range against the Pacific sunset. These containers were filled with electronics, cheap textiles, and plastic toys, the detritus of the old world. Dock workers refused to unload them for worthless paper. They stood at the gates with crossed arms, watching the ships bob in the harbor. They demanded immediate resource transfer, fuel, food, medicine. The standoff at the ports became the first battleground of the new normal. The president deployed the National Guard, not to quell riots, but to facilitate trade. It was a surreal sight, uniformed soldiers acting not as warriors, but as accountants of the physical world. Officers with clipboards walked the lines, weighing grain sacks and certifying the purity of gold dust at checkpoints. The military was no longer just a fighting force. It was the only trusted bank left. Captain Elias Miller, a logistics officer from Ohio, found himself in charge of Pier 40 in Los Angeles. His job used to involve coordinating missile strikes. Now he was arbitrating the exchange rate between crates of Chinese antibiotics and Midwestern soy. He watched as a shipping magnate tried to bribe a union foreman with a stack of cash. The foreman swatted the money away like a fly. "Get me diesel!" the foreman growled. "Or the crane doesn't move." Miller realized then that the hierarchy of the world had not just shifted, it had inverted. The man who owned the ship was powerless before the man who operated the crane. The leverage had moved from capital to labor in the most violent way possible. And here lay the paradox. The government had stepped in to ensure freedom of trade, but in doing so, had to monitor every single transaction to tax the barter. The Internal Revenue Service, stripped of its ability to monitor bank accounts, deployed agents to grain silos and fuel depots. Total economic liberty came at the cost of total surveillance. If the government knows how many eggs you trade for penicillin, is the trade truly free? Or have we merely traded the tyranny of the central bank for the tyranny of the quartermaster? The IRS agents wore Kevlar vests now, not suits. They didn't audit spreadsheets, they audited barns. By the winter of 2027, the new normal had settled in like a heavy frost. The skyscrapers of Manhattan were largely dark, the financial firms inside them gutted. The glass towers, once the monuments of the universe, were now cold sarcophagi. Inside, the servers that once processed trillions of dollars in high-frequency trades had been ripped out and sold for scrap metal, copper and gold components being worth more than the algorithms they once ran. The rats moved into the corner offices where masters of the universe once stood. Yet, while the cities slept, the rural counties and the industrial belts were ablaze with light. A new economy had emerged, one based on the skill ledger. Digital platforms, hastily coded by former crypto engineers who had pivoted from speculation to survival, tracked reputation and labor. This was not a currency. It was a permanent record of utility. A heart surgeon's time was tokenized, traded for a year's worth of organic produce or the construction of a solar grid. This transition was violent for the ego, if not the body. Consider the plight of the consultant class. Thousands of mid-level executives, brand strategists, and diversity coordinators found themselves wandering a marketplace that had no shelf space for their wares. Julian, a former senior vice president of brand synergy, stood in a queue outside a repurposed distribution center in Ohio. He wore his Italian loafers, now scuffed and muddy. He held a sign that listed his skills: strategic planning, stakeholder management, copy editing. A man in a welding mask walked down the line, looking for help. He stopped at Julian. "Can you lift a 50-pound sack of cement?" the welder asked. "I have back issues," Julian stammered, "but I can organize your inventory logistics." The welder laughed, a harsh metallic sound behind the mask. "I don't need a spreadsheet, buddy. I need a back." He moved on to the next man, a former high school football coach who was hired on the spot for 3 meals a day. Julian was left standing in the cold. In the skill ledger, there was no column for corporate synergy. You could either fix the roof, grow the corn, or heal the sick. If you could not, you were dependent on the charity of those who could. The wealthy were no longer those with high bank balances. They were those with high utility. The hedge fund manager starved in his penthouse, surrounded by art he couldn't eat and gold he couldn't spend because he lacked the reputation to trade it safely. The carpenter feasted. The welder was treated like nobility. It was a brutal meritocracy that the Trump administration hailed as the return of the American spirit. But the engineer staring at the code of the new skill ledger wondered something darker. Her name was Elena, a former Google architect now working for the Department of Commerce's Barter Stabilization Unit. As she watched the transactions scroll by, a kidney surgery traded for a barn raising, a coding lesson traded for clean water, she saw the terrifying efficiency of it. She wondered when the system had stopped serving the people and started serving the survival of the fittest. In a world of pure utility, mercy is an inefficiency. If a man breaks his back and can no longer work, the ledger shows his value drop to 0. Who feeds him then? The community or the algorithm? Elena sat in a bunker in Colorado, watching the reputation scores of millions of Americans fluctuate in real time. It was a gamification of survival. She saw a teacher's score drop because she got sick and couldn't teach for a week. The algorithm flagged her as high risk, low output. Elena's finger hovered over the override key. The old world was corrupt because it allowed the rich to buy their way out of trouble. The new world was cruel because it allowed no one to rest. Is a society that demands constant utility actually a society, or is it just a labor camp with better scenery? The climax of this transition occurred during the Black Week of February. A cyber attack, attributed to a coalition of nations excluded from the new American resource zones. Likely a joint effort by disaffected European intelligence agencies and state-sponsored hackers from the Global South, targeted the skill ledgers. It happened at 3 a.m. The digital record of who owed what to whom was erased. The reputation scores, the labor tokens, the history of transactions, all wiped. For 3 days, the silence was deafening. Chaos threatened to consume the fragility of the new barter system. People stood in the streets, clutching tools and food, unable to prove their creditworthiness without the digital backbone. The trust that had been slowly rebuilt was severed. A man with a truckload of firewood wouldn't drop it off at the bakery because the baker couldn't digitally prove he was good for the bread next week. The gears of survival ground to a halt. The fear was primal. Without the ledger, every stranger was a potential thief. The consultant class huddled in their shelters, terrified that without the digital enforcement of order, the physical enforcement of the strong would begin. It was the breaking point. The risk was total societal collapse. If the ledger couldn't be trusted, and the dollar was dead, there was nothing left but violence. Rumors spread of militias forming to seize food stores. The darkness of the cities seemed to stretch out, threatening to swallow the flickering lights of the rural zones. The president addressed the nation, not from a studio, but from a grain silo in Iowa, surrounded by the tangible assets of the republic. The signal was broadcast over emergency radio frequencies and mesh networks. He looked tired, the weight of the new world heavy on his shoulders, but his voice was steady. The cameras caught the dust motes dancing in the harsh work lights. He didn't offer a technical fix. He didn't promise that the NSA would recover the data. He didn't offer a stimulus package. He declared that the trust of the community was the final backup. He urged Americans to honor their word, to trade on a handshake until the systems were restored. The computer is just a scorecard, he said, his voice crackling over the airwaves. You know who your neighbors are. You know who works hard. You know who lies. The government cannot give you trust. You have to build it. If you need a machine to tell you if a man is honest, then we have already lost. And miraculously they did. It started in the small towns. A farmer gave the milk away, trusting the mechanic would fix the tractor when the time came. A doctor treated the fever, accepting a verbal promise of firewood for the winter. The communities that had spent decades isolated by digital screens found themselves bound by the necessity of physical survival. They looked each other in the eye, stripped of the anonymity of the banking system, and made a choice. The attack failed to break the nation. Instead, it solidified the death of the dollar. The currency was no longer paper or code. The currency was reputation. When the skill ledger came back online 4 days later, the data was corrupted. But it didn't matter. The towns had created their own physical ledgers, written in notebooks and remembered in conversations. People realized they didn't need the server farm in Virginia to tell them who was valuable. They knew. Now, as we look at the landscape of this post-dollar world, the transformation is absolute. The United States is no longer a financial empire. It is a fortress of production. The stock market is a museum piece, a digital ruin visited by students of history who marvel that we once valued companies that produced nothing but advertisements. The ticker tape parades are gone, replaced by harvest festivals. The IRS collects tithes of grain, energy credits, and technology patents. The Treasury Department is essentially a massive warehouse management firm. The global economy has fractured into regional blocks of barter, with the US trading energy for rare earth minerals, bypassing the concept of price entirely. We do not ask, how much is a barrel of oil? We ask, what can this barrel of oil build? Diplomatic summits are no longer about exchange rates. They are swap meets on a geopolitical scale. The silent rise of barter didn't just change how we buy things. It changed how we value human life. We are no longer consumers defined by credit scores. We are producers defined by our contribution. The influencer culture died instantly, suffocated by the lack of surplus attention. The celebrity culture withered. In its place rose a culture of competence. Teenagers stopped dreaming of being YouTubers and started dreaming of being electricians, botanists, and engineers. The heroes of the new age are not the ones who can garner 1 million likes, but the ones who can purify 1 million gallons of water. But as the sun sets on the Trump 47 era, a lingering shadow remains. We have returned to the oldest form of economics, armed with the newest forms of technology. We traded the tyranny of the bank for the tyranny of the tribe. In the old world, if you were an outcast, you could still buy bread if you had money. The dollar was impersonal. It didn't care if you were liked, only if you were solvent. It was a cold but impartial master. In the new world, if the community rejects you, you starve. There is no anonymity in a reputation economy. If you are difficult, if you are strange, if you are dissident, the ledger reflects it. The baker may refuse to trade with you not because you lack value, but because he simply doesn't like your politics or your face. The village has returned, and with it, the village idiot and the village pariah. Stability has returned. Prosperity is tangible. You can touch it, weigh it, eat it. The shelves are full, but they are behind counters guarded by those who know the value of sweat. The only thing missing is the ability to hide. We have built a glass house of mutual obligation. In the end, the dollar didn't die because it was weak. It died because it was a lie that we all agreed to stop telling. It was a comfortable fiction that allowed us to outsource the difficulty of trust to a third party. We paid the banks to trust each other for us. When that party failed, we were left with each other. The future isn't about how much money you have. It's about what you can do. And perhaps, that is the most terrifying correction of all. Because in a world without money, there are no excuses. You are exactly what you are worth to the person standing in front of you. The mask is off. And for the first time in a century, America is staring at its own reflection, calloused hands and all. The silence that started in the server room has been filled with the noise of work. But in the quiet moments of the night, many wonder if we have found freedom, or if we have merely forged a heavier set of chains, ones made of iron, blood, and the unforgiving judgment of our neighbors.